Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting.
Oh.
Well, not the ones you're hoping for.
Okay. Thank you?
You want squeals of delight.
Yes!
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
To get those, make everyone on your list feel heard with gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, vintage pieces, and home decor. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
With 132 million users and an unrivaled selection of sports trading cards and memorabilia, eBay is the home of collectibles. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Start building your collection today.
The Athletic. For Gilles, racing was a romantic thing. My preoccupation was in keeping myself alive. But for him, the thing was to be fastest, every race, every lap. I believe he was the fastest racing driver the world has ever seen. If he could come back tomorrow and live his life over again, I'm sure he would do it the same way and with the same love. That was the right word. More than anyone I've known, Gilles was in love with motor racing.
Hello, and welcome to And Colossally That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Richard Williams.
And I'm Matt Bishop, and I hope you enjoyed that rather different start to today's podcast. The words I read were those of Jody Scheckter, the 1979 Formula One world champion, as quoted in Motorsport magazine, and they were about the man we're going to talk about today. Yes, the great Gilles Villeneuve. Across little more than 4 full seasons in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Villeneuve started 67 Formula One Grand Prix, winning 6 of them. To some, particularly those unfamiliar with this small, quietly spoken driver from Canada, that might seem like a solid, if fairly unspectacular record, and yet speak to anyone in Grand Prix circles at the time, particularly those who watched him race at close quarters, and they'll tell you that Gilles was right up there with the very best ever to get behind the wheel. A thrilling, explosively quick and supremely talented driver who ranks alongside the likes of Fangio, Clark, Stewart, Senna, Schumacher, and now Hamilton and Verstappen. And in this episode, we'll try to explain why.
Yep, that's the aim. In truth, there's so much to talk about when it comes to Gilles Villeneuve, certainly too much to squeeze into one podcast. So on today's episode, we're going to park 1 or 2 topics, like his falling out with Didier Pironi and his tragic violent death at Zolder in 1982. And we're going to talk specifically about Gilles Villeneuve, the driving genius, a guy who was so expressive behind the wheel that he made piloting an F1 car into a sort of art form.
He did indeed, and to help us do that, we've picked out just 3 races from his Formula One career that we think encapsulate what made him so very special. And we're going to go through them in chronological order. But first, before we get into those races, we both watched Villeneuve in his pomp, didn't we, Richard? But were you, or are you, a Villeneuve fan? And given that this podcast is all about reappraising the past, Has your feeling towards him changed at all over the years?
No, it hasn't. I was a fan then, and I'm a fan now. And that's because no driver in our lifetimes has more exhilaratingly embodied the thing, in the end, that we all want from motor racing, the thing that draws us to it, and that's drama. Apart from everything else, when Gilles was on the track, drama was guaranteed. And I mean, as a spectator, what do you look for in a racing driver? You look for someone whose first instinct when he gets into a car is to find someone to overtake. And that, very obviously, was the bloke in the number 27 Ferrari. So what's your lasting impression of him, Matt?
Well, I agree with you. First of all, I agree with you about drama. I think that's a good word to use, Richard. But in addition to that, in addition to the drama, above all, Gilles Villeneuve was quick. Sensationally quick. Unbelievably quick in the wet, especially. And a battler. A real battler. Unable, not just unwilling, but unable to throw in the towel. Incapable of giving up. And all of that was driven by passion and, as Jody Scheckter rightly says, by love. By love, too. But Villeneuve had his critics. Some journalists of the time, and even some of his rival drivers, thought he drove with so little margin that they called him a rock ape. That was the term often used about him. It isn't often used about anyone these days, rock ape, and rightly not, because it's not actually a very nice term. Rock apes were, or are, a species of violent humanoid creatures that were allegedly seen by American soldiers during the Vietnam War, dwelling in rocky terrain, hence rock ape, and or even hurling rocks at them, at the GIs I mean, hence again rock ape. John Watson was very critical of Gilles Villeneuve's on-track demeanour, for example. Watson thought Gilles, he thought he was a bit of a rock ape. And by the way, to be fair to Watty and anybody else who might use that term or other derogatory terms about him, it wasn't that Watty or any of Villeneuve's other critics thought he was a danger to other drivers, because he wasn't aggressive in that way, actually, but that he was a danger to himself. He was too often too close to the ragged edge, they thought. And by the way, Jackie Stewart thought the same way about the young Jackie Ickx, if you remember. Mm-hmm. Yet still Watson was one of the drivers who stopped to try to help Villeneuve in his hour of need at Zolder in 1982. In vain, as it turned out, of course. I'm actually very fond of Watty, and I think that was typical of him, to stop and try to help a fellow driver in extremis, whom he didn't, in all honesty, have a lot of time for. By the way, he stopped for Niki Lauda as well, hadn't he?
Yes, he did.
At Nürburgring, in 76.
Yep.
Anyway, we're going to get into our three races in a moment, but before that, it's probably worth our briefly exploring Gilles' route to Formula One, because it wasn't at all conventional, was it, Richard?
No, it wasn't. Unlike today, when virtually every F1 driver follows the same career path of karting from a very young age and then climbing a fairly rigid single-seater ladder. Back in the 1970s, when Gilles arrived in F1, drivers still came from a variety of racing backgrounds, which to my mind made them more interesting.
Yes, less formulaic.
Yep.
Yeah.
But even so, Gilles' start was especially unconventional, because although he was interested in cars and driving fast from a young age, he actually got his start in motorsport racing snowmobiles in his native Quebec, where the winters are long and cold.
It's amazing to think that. I mean, no one could do that now.
You could not. No,
you could not.
You think what fun he must have.
Yes.
And as you might expect, it was a pretty hazardous pastime. But Gilles was blessed with an unusual level of bravery and, as would become clear, an innate feeling for driving, or riding in the case of a snowmobile, at high speed.
Do you ride or drive a snowmobile?
Ride, I would have thought.
Maybe you ride one, yeah.
We mentioned the great Canadian writer Jerry Donaldson on this podcast before, and his book Gilles Villeneuve, The Life of the Legendary Racing Driver, is certainly the definitive Gilles book, and we'd thoroughly recommend picking up a copy. But I want to read you a short passage from Jerry's book because it highlights the role snowmobile racing had on the driver Gilles would become. Quote, "With a steadfast belief in his own ability, he kept the throttle level with one handlebar pressed wide open, while the brake lever on the other was seldom brought into play. He developed a finely tuned sense of balance and an almost delicate sensitivity to know just how far he could tempt the centrifugal force that contrived to throw his mount off into the hay bales surrounding the slippery circuit. His point of no return became much farther than most as he honed his reflexes to a lightning degree and trusted them to rescue him from the brink at the very last moment." Doesn't that sound just like Gilles, the Formula One driver?
It does. And I may just draw to your attention that you said centrifugal, not centrifugal. That's the American spelling or pronunciation, sorry. Was that correct? Was that deliberate? Because you're talking about a North American?
Oh, it must be then, in that case.
I'm interested. Centrifugal, centrifugal. Answers on a postcard,
tomato,
please,
tomato.
listeners.
Potato, potato.
Tomato,
Let's call the whole thing
tomato.
off. No, carry on. Your go.
Let's not call the whole thing off just over centrifugal and centrifugal. Anyway, you asked me, does that just sound like Gilles? You did ask me that, didn't you?
I did.
You did, and it absolutely does. As I've said already, flat out everywhere, all the time. And by the way, even on the road, actually. Back in the day, Formula One drivers, and you know, this is not defensible, but it's just how things were. Back in the day, Formula One drivers often used to race each other on the road. Yeah, it was irresponsible, but it was another age, and they just did it. Some of the drivers actually were quite disciplined on the road, and actually that was Jody Scheckter's style. Well, certainly it was by the time he'd arrived at Ferrari anyway. I don't know whether sideways Scheckter, as he used to... Oh, I think I did that in an Australian accent. Anyway, sideways Scheckter in a South African accent. I don't know whether he was a bit of a rock ape on the road back in the day, but by the time he'd become a Ferrari driver, he was more professional. Anyway, Gilles wasn't. Gilles was always crazy fast, even on the road, and he enjoyed that white knuckles, 10/10ths, ragged edge, banzai reputation. In fact, Jody says that Gilles would speed up as he neared Maranello to make sure that any tifosi who happened to spot his Ferrari on its way to the factory would see that it was going hell for leather, screeching its brakes, tyre smoke billowing from all four corners, opposite lock everywhere, of course.
I believe that when he drove into the factory, they'd change all four tyres on his road car as a matter of course before he went off.
Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
And I can imagine it kind of that tick, tick, tick and the smell. Yeah, telltale. Gilles Villeneuve drive from the airport to Maranello, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
One careful driver.
Yes. Anyway, the other unconventional element of Gilles' route to Formula One was that not just the snowmobiles, but that also he never raced in Europe at all before making it into Formula One. Can you imagine that today?
You cannot.
You can't. You can't. And here's the thing. People may or may not know that James Hunt played a big role in Gilles Villeneuve getting his Formula One chance, actually. As Alistair Caldwell, McLaren's former chief mechanic and team manager, remembers it, the first he, or indeed many other people in Formula One had heard of Gilles, was when Hunt and a few other Formula One regulars went to Canada. I think the other regulars, certainly Alan Jones was among them, perhaps Vittorio Brambilla, certainly Jones. Anyway, they went to Canada to do a Formula Atlantic race at Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers, in 1976, which was something that Formula One stars occasionally did back then. And Gilles beat them all. That was remarkable because he didn't only beat Hunt, but also Alan Jones, as I say, who, like Hunt, would also go on to become a Formula One world champion. According to Caldwell, quote, "When James came back, he said, 'This kid's a genius. He can really drive.'" And it was a really, this is Caldwell still speaking, it was a very, very rare thing for a driver to extol the virtues of another. So Teddy Mayer, obviously the McLaren boss, called Gilles, telephoned him and asked him to come and see us. This is still Caldwell's quote. "The following day, our receptionist called up to say there was this young man downstairs called Gilles Villeneuve who'd like to see you." Now, this was the kind of guy we liked. He'd found a flight to London, he'd made his way to Colnbrook, just west of London where the McLaren factory was, and here he was. We showed him the cars, and he was just mad about them, full of enthusiasm. And this was the perfect kind of driver for us. Needed no babying, and he couldn't wait to drive the car. End quote. So, as we'll go on to discuss, Gilles did all but one of his F1 races, Grand Prix, for Ferrari, and that's as it should be, really, because you could say, and we probably will go on to say, that he was the archetypal Ferrari driver in so many ways. But it was the Scuderia's arch-rivals McLaren who actually gave him his Formula One start at Silverstone in 1977. He'd finished that British Grand Prix in 11th place, after losing a couple of laps to a faulty temperature gauge, but by that stage he'd already impressed many observers with his otherworldly car control. Were you there, by the way?
No, I wasn't. I wish I had been.
No, I was there, British Grand Prix in 76, 78 and 79, but I wasn't there in 77. Anyway, this is an interesting point that not a lot of people, I think, necessarily appreciate, but I might be wrong. But it's my impression that not that many do. We'll see. Another young driver was also looking very impressive in the second half of 1977, and that was Patrick Tambay, who was doing mighty things in a lowly Ensign. I mean, he would have finished third at Zandvoort in that car, but for, I think, running out of fuel, he ended up fifth or sixth, but he would have finished third on the podium in an Ensign. It just didn't really happen, and he was a rookie. Anyway, this may sound odd now, but actually Ferrari and McLaren were both gunning to hire Tambay, not Villeneuve. However lyrical Caldwell went on to wax about him, and it was only because McLaren got Tambay's signature first that Ferrari signed whom both teams then regarded as the second best choice, Villeneuve. Now, to be clear, Patrick Tambay was a lovely man, much missed, and was actually a very fine driver. You know, a two-time Grand Prix winner for Ferrari, funnily enough, and a two-time Can-Am champion, but he wasn't as good as Gilles Villeneuve. I mean, almost no one was.
No, but McLaren would have been taking a chance at that point, given the option. You know, Tambay was a known quantity and a very good driver, and much more experienced. But anyway, fate stepped in with an invitation to Gilles to test for Ferrari, and in 1977 he flew to Italy to meet Enzo Ferrari and to try one of the cars
at Fiorano, I suppose.
At Fiorano, yeah. And I think we should also mention the role played by the tobacco company executive John Hogan, who handled Marlboro's motor racing sponsorship, which included sponsoring McLaren, of course, and, of course, paying the salaries of Ferrari's drivers. After that race at Trois-Rivières, James Hunt had talked to Hogan about Gilles as well as to Teddy Mayer, and Hogan certainly played a part in getting Ferrari interested and in helping to make the deal. The Marlboro name wasn't yet on the Italian cars, but it would be on Gilles' helmet and his overalls.
Just to say, John Hogan, I thought was a great guy. I really enjoyed his company. He died only about 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah. Complications from COVID. And
a very important backroom figure in Formula One for many, many years.
Australian, of course. Yeah.
And as we've talked about before, Enzo Ferrari had a strange relationship with some of his drivers, but Gilles was always a bit different, partly because quite aside from anything else, he reminded the old man of Tazio Nuvolari, who Ferrari had run in his team before the war and who he often said was his favourite driver, along with Stirling Moss.
Interesting that Stirling Moss is in that same echelon when, of course, he never drove for the old man.
No, and was
nearly did.
Yeah, nearly did, was about to when he had his bad accident in 1962, but there we are.
Another podcast.
Enzo wrote about Gilles in his memoirs, and he said, "When they presented me with this little Canadian, this minuscule bundle of nerves, I immediately recognized in him the physique of Nuvolari, and I said to myself, let's give him a try." Quite a compliment coming from the old man who'd spent 6 decades closely observing all the greats.
I mean, a fantastic compliment, actually. And speaking of the greats, one man who Enzo Ferrari didn't necessarily see eye to eye with, as I think we've mentioned on the pod before in previous episodes, was Juan Manuel Fangio, the 5-time Formula One world champion from the 1950s. And if I may, I'd like to quote Fangio now, because after Villeneuve's death in 1982, he, Fangio, spoke of Enzo Ferrari's Tazio Nuvolari comparison. He spoke his words in Spanish, of course, but here's an English translation. Quote, "Gilles Villeneuve will remain a member of the family of truly great drivers forever. Enzo Ferrari, a great authority on such matters," slightly damning with faint praise there, I would say. But anyway, never mind. "Enzo Ferrari, a great authority on such matters, has compared him to Tazio Nuvolari. In my younger days, Nuvolari was the absolute idol. All drivers aspired to be compared to the great Nuvolari. They struggled to match him. They couldn't, but they could try to imitate him. So to be compared to Nuvolari by Ferrari is to receive the very highest praise." It's a good quote, isn't it?
Very good, and that's absolutely right. And the rest, as they say, is history. Niki Lauda left Ferrari at the end of 1977 after sealing his second world title, and Villeneuve got his chance. And he'd race for the team until his death at the wheel in 1982.
Yes, that brings us up to speed quite quickly on Villeneuve's early career and how he came to race for Ferrari. So, now, let's get into the 3 races that we think exemplify the Villeneuve genius, because, as you say, Richard, all of them were driven at the wheel of a Ferrari. And to be clear, we haven't selected wins only. In fact, we've chosen a win, a second, and a third. And the first race we've chosen is from 1979. I bet people were expecting this one. And the first was chosen in 1979, the 1979 French Grand Prix, in fact, at Dijon. Now, if you're familiar with Gilles Villeneuve, you'll know that this was not a race he won, although he'd won 3 Formula One Grand Prix by that time already. The first of those wins in freezing cold conditions on home soil in Canada in 1978, perhaps one of the very coldest Grand Prix of all time. I think the mercury got up to about 5 degrees at one point. Anyway, at the circuit that now bears his name, the circuit Gilles Villeneuve. The second was in South Africa the following year, 1979. And the third, the very next Grand Prix, Long Beach in the United States, 1979, where he won from pole position and posted fastest lap. And honestly, there are great things to say about all 3 of those Villeneuve wins, but we haven't got time to do all of those. Besides, Dijon showcased something else, and in many ways, it's the defining race of his whole career.
Yeah, and it's actually one of those races that became famous for several reasons, because some might remember it not so much even for Villeneuve's swashbuckling battle with René Arnoux, more on which in a moment, but for the fact that Jean-Pierre Jabouille scored the very first F1 victory for a turbo-powered car in a Renault, on home soil no less. French team, French chassis and engine, French tyres, French petrol, French oil, and a French driver.
Vive la France.
Vive la France. Ouais, jour de gloire. A hugely significant moment, not just for Renault and Jabouille, but for F1 in general. Because up to then, the Renaults had been fast but hugely unreliable. But within a few years, every car on the grid would be powered by a turbo. But nowadays, Dijon 79 is very much remembered for the mother of all on-track battles between Villeneuve in the Ferrari and Arnoux, who was driving the other Renault.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Jabouille because I've always had a soft spot for him. You know, as you say, and as we're going to go on to describe, the race is known for the battle for second. But actually, a quarter of a minute up the road, winning in very, very dominant style was Jabouille.
Yeah, and he'd done all the work developing the Renault Turbo and, been laughed at like the whole team when they turned up first and, the thing didn't go very well and it looked a bit eccentric. And
it looked eccentric. It was pouring smoke. He never finished a race.
So this was payback.
It was. Back to the subject. The fight for second place between Villeneuve and Arnoux, which was ultimately won by Villeneuve, is often regarded as the greatest wheel-to-wheel battle in the history of Formula One. Now, that is a very sweeping statement, but I think we're going to try and justify it because it may just be right. And by the way, I urge you, dear listener, if you haven't watched it, to go and check it out on YouTube because it really is something else. So how did it play out and why was it such a pivotal race in the Villeneuve canon? Did you like the use of the word canon there?
I like pivotable, actually. Sorry.
Pivotable cannons. I'm going to write a novel one day called Pivotable Cannons. Anyway, going back to the subject, Harvey Postlethwaite, not pivotable necessarily. That is a tongue twister. The pivotable Postlethwaite. Harvey Postlethwaite, the British engineer who would later be hand-picked by Enzo Ferrari to help fix the team's chassis problems in 1981, if you remember. Mm-hmm. He once said of Villeneuve, and I'm going to read another quote here, "I've never known a racing driver quite like him. Given a choice between going for the lead and destroying his tyres, or going carefully and finishing third, Gilles would always choose the former." Great quote, and quite right. And although Villeneuve did in fact beat Arnoux to the second place they were fighting over at Dijon 79 was a bit like that, actually, because the Renaults of Jabouille and Arnoux locked out the front row, making the most of their much superior turbo horsepower. But Villeneuve qualified third in his Ferrari 312 T4 with its torquey 3-litre flat 12, and he took the lead at the start because the Renault turbos, as they had a tendency to do, if you remember, got bogged down. Anyway, Gilles knew that the Renaults were likely to catch him, so what did he do? In true Postlethwaite style, or in the way that Postlethwaite described, he put the hammer down hard. Of course, he did destroy his tyres in the process, but as Postlethwaite said, he was a driver, Villeneuve was a driver, who'd rather risk it all for the win than play safe and settle for a minor placing. He knew one way to race, and one way only, and that's what he did at Dijon that day. Inevitably, yes, he was caught by the Renault plural, but that didn't happen until that 46, with Gilles even more sideways everywhere than usual because he liked to set the car up with plenty of oversteer anyway. But on that day, the oversteer was even more excessive because he'd ruined his tyres by overdriving. But as I say, despite that, it took 46 laps for Jabouille to catch him and finally force his way through. And then we got the Arnoux battle, didn't we, Richard?
Yes, and there was clearly a lot of respect between Arnoux and Villeneuve, and actually after this famous battle they became very good friends. Their backgrounds weren't too dissimilar in that they'd both got into F1 the hard way. Arnoux actually started as a racing mechanic for a long time before earning his place in the cockpit. And his character behind the wheel was quite Gilles-like too, in that he was extremely brave and determined. They both had a kind of urchin quality, a hint of recklessness, which is the sort of thing that fans respond to.
And I gather that Arnoux was very popular with the mechanics because he was one of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, exactly.
And do you remember whenever you look at a picture of, or almost whenever you look at a picture of Arno, he's hunched over the wheel, leaning forwards, his head craned forwards, particularly distinctive body language in the car, I always thought.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about the mechanics. It's a bit like Hermann Lang in the Mercedes team before the war, when the rest of the team were aristos, more or less, Caracciolo, von Brauchitsch and Seaman. And Lang had been a mechanic, so he was, and he was actually quicker than the other three.
Yeah.
So the mechanics were very keen on him. So,
yes.
Anyway, in this battle between Villeneuve and Arnoux, there was a level of trust there between the two of them. I think both of them knew the other guy, even though they might have been banging wheels. They weren't actually trying to have each other off, something which even in the late 70s could easily have been lethal.
And that is a good point, well made. And I don't want to get sidetracked into comparing the 70s with now, but it was different. You might give no quarter, but you didn't really try and have the other guy into the barrier.
That kind of combat hadn't been seen before with contact. It was enthralling and exciting to watch, but you didn't think it was dangerous because they were taking some sort of care.
Yes, some did, but I agree with you, and we'll come to that. But yes, what you say about trust was apparent, because even though the two banged wheels, as you say, several times actually, and they diced, wheel to wheel, neck and neck over the final 3 laps of the race, there was no deliberate, let's put it that way, there was no deliberate sideswiping or deliberately aggressive behaviour, just hard, honest wheel-to-wheel racing.
Yeah.
Arnoux had actually got ahead with 3 laps to go, but his Renault's turbo engine was suffering a fuel pickup issue, so Villeneuve was able to stick with him. Jabouille had motored away, but Arnoux could not. And with 2 laps to go, Villeneuve launched an incredible attack up the inside, at the end of the start-finish straight, up the inside into turn 1. It's amazing. You must look at it on YouTube if you haven't seen it before. Braking later than late from way too far back, actually. All 4 wheels locked up, tyre smoke everywhere, the car twitching this way and that as he held it all together. But it worked. He'd nicked second place from Arnoux against the odds, and I don't think Arnoux was expecting him to go from that far back. But it wasn't enough to seal the deal because, Arnoux was a fighter, like Gilles, and he too was in fighting mode now. And on the final lap, it was pandemonium. Arnoux, yes, fought back. As I say, the 2 cars running side by side through several turns, banging wheels, we've said that a few times, but it's true, running off track a bit sometimes, neither driver giving an inch, a millimetre. Eventually, with what our mutual friend Jerry Donaldson describes as, quote, a final fit of demonic late braking. Great phrase that, isn't it? Villeneuve nosed in front and held on to his advantage to the line. Actually, I don't mean to criticise, and I'm really not, but actually Arnoux left the door open at a crucial moment. I've actually watched these last laps on YouTube with Kevin Magnussen many times. Kevin loves that kind of thing. He loves the history of the sport. He's really interested in it. And his hero, by the way, is Sterling Moss. How about that? Mm-hmm. Who obviously had retired long before Kevin was born. Anyway, Kevin always looks wistful at that point when we're watching it, as if to say, oh, René, take a tighter line, mate. You can just see it on Kev the racer's face. Anyway, it was truly fantastic stuff and an example of what made Villeneuve great. That so stubborn refusal to accept that he was beaten. That, how can I put it, that bloody-minded determination to battle every inch of the way. And by the way, personal reminiscence, on the day in 1979, age 16, I watched it alone in my bedroom at home in London on an 11-inch black and white portable TV, which is all I had. It's all we had in the house, actually. And I remember feeling that I was going to burst with enthusiasm afterwards, but there was no one I could talk to about it. No one I knew was remotely interested in Formula One. It wasn't nearly as popular as it is now, of course. My brother liked cricket. my dad liked tennis. My mum liked no sports at all. And the next day at school, no one had watched it. No one. As I say, Formula One was nothing like as popular then as it would later become, and none of my mates had even heard of Gilles Villeneuve or René Arnoux. Anyway, Richard, have you ever seen a better on-track fight in Formula One? And do you remember where you were when you watched it?
I don't, in fact. I'm sorry, I don't have your pin-sharp memory of 1979, but I was watching it on the telly, for sure. And no, in answer to your question, I've never seen a more spectacular on-track fight than that one. And of course, it took place in the days before tarmac runoff areas and penalties for exceeding track limits.
Which we could talk about at length if we wanted to.
We probably will do one day, but
yes.
Nobody was wagging a finger at them. They were just quite rightly, allowed to get on with it and be grown-ups and sort it out themselves. Although actually, a Grand Prix of just a little while before we recorded this episode at Austin, Texas, produced a battle between Max Verstappen and Lando Norris that wasn't entirely dissimilar.
I knew you wouldn't be able to resist making a comparison with today.
No, and I was thinking about Dijon 79 while I was watching it, although the Max and Lando show came to an unhappy end, to do with track limits and not showing the other driver respect by allowing him space, which, despite the extreme ferocity of their battle, is what Gilles and René managed to do.
Indeed they did.
And clearly the crowd at Dijon and those watching on TV around the world had been absolutely captivated by what went on. And the two protagonists loved it too, as did Enzo Ferrari, who cooed about his wonderful driver. And Mario Andretti famously described Villeneuve and Arnoux as a couple of young lions clawing at each other.
What a good quote.
Yeah.
Typical Mario.
But not everyone was quite as glowing about what had taken place. Mauro Forghieri, who was Ferrari's chief designer, thought Villeneuve had taken too many risks, and some senior members of the Grand Prix Drivers Association agreed with him. In fact, at the next race at Silverstone, during a GPDA meeting, Villeneuve and Arnoux were widely admonished in front of their peers by the likes of Villeneuve's teammate Jody Scheckter, Niki Lauda, and Emerson Fittipaldi, all of whom thought the way the pair had driven was far too dangerous. Or maybe it was too exciting, and maybe it had,
Do you think there was a bit of envy?
I think there probably was, yeah.
Might have been.
Yeah. And according to the great journalist Nigel Roebuck, another mutual friend of ours, who was good friends with Villeneuve, particularly good friends, close to Villeneuve, the Canadian couldn't believe the things these senior drivers were saying. Jesus, he said to Roebuck, they're supposed to be racing drivers. But what do you think, Matt? Were Scheckter and co.'s concerns valid at the time?
Well, it's a good question. As I've already said, John Watson was also one of the critics of the Villeneuve-Arnoux battle at Dijon, as well as the drivers you've mentioned. And I think you have to remember that this was the 1970s. All those drivers had seen tragedy. All those drivers had seen death close up. Lauda had nearly died himself at Nürburgring in 1976, of course. Scheckter had stopped at Watkins Glen in 1973, hoping to help François Sévère, whose Tyrrell he'd been following in practice when Sévère had had his big shunt at the uphill S's there. And, Jody's told me about this, and what Jody saw when he got out to have a look, there's no easy way to describe this, but anyway, one driver in two halves. He never quite got over it. He certainly raced in a more circumspect way after that, even though he was still quick, very quick. And indeed, he won the Formula One Drivers' World Championship 6 years later. And who else did we mention? Right, yes, Fittipaldi and Watson had also had more than their fair share of horrors in the 1970s. Emerson had had to cope with the death of his team leader at Lotus, Jochen Rindt, obviously, at Monza in 1970, when he was a very raw, new rookie. And Watty had seen a lot of bad stuff too. By the way, as we've said, Watty and Emerson Fittipaldi both stopped to try to help Niki Lauda at Nürburgring. So, they'd all seen bad stuff, and I think we should remember that. So I don't blame them, no. And although I do have a hell of a lot of respect for Mario Andretti, I think as a racing driver, we all do, obviously. But he could be, get ready for a bit of a controversial statement, but Andretti could be a bit of a rock ape sometimes too. I remember talking to Jonny Rutherford about AJ Foyt and Mario Andretti, actually, when I was at Indy in 2017, when I was there as a McLaren guy to handle the comms and PR operation around Fernando Alonso's first attempt at the Indy 500, which you probably remember.
I do, and you did very well with the publicity out of that, as I recall.
That was the whole plan.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, Fernando, you're going to go and try and win the Indy 500, but really, we needed to get some positive PR for our sponsors when we weren't getting any in Formula One. And if you remember, he skipped Monaco to do it.
He did, yeah.
In Jim Clark's style.
Exactly.
Anyway, unfortunately, he didn't win. But anyway, Rutherford was full of praise for both of them, obviously, Andretti and Foyt. Not surprisingly, because, they're both absolute Indy legends, as, by the way, Rutherford is as well. But Johnny Rutherford left me in no doubt that of the two, the driver he'd rather go wheel to wheel with was AJ, not Mario. No question about it.
Interesting. So that's Dijon 79, and after this short break, we'll look at another of Villeneuve's career-defining races.
Hockey season is here, and the chase for Upper Deck Young Guns rookies is on. As the home of collectibles since 1995, eBay is your go-to spot to take home hockey's hottest drop, the 2024-25 Upper Deck Series 1 hobby boxes. Drop the puck on this season with eBay's unrivaled selection of trading card singles, sealed boxes, and memorabilia. Start pulling heat today at ebay.com/upperdeck. That's ebay.com/upperdeck. Come through and collect with us today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The next race we're going to talk about is the 1981 Spanish Grand Prix at Jarama, which is often regarded as Villeneuve's greatest ever race, certainly his greatest ever win, and with good reason, in my opinion. How shall we put it? That year's Ferrari, the 126CK, was not a very good car. Would we go so far as to call it, this is a technical term I'm going to use now, a shit box? Would we, Richard?
Perhaps you could give that in your Niki Lauda voice.
It was a total shit box.
Very excellent. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we would call it one of those. That is an appropriate term. However, by then, Ferrari had a turbo engine, but although it was a very powerful engine, potentially the most powerful engine on the grid, in fact, it suffered terribly from turbo lag, which for listeners who haven't steeped themselves in F1 jargon, although I'm sure many of our listeners have, is a delayed and uneven delivery of power. But even worse than that was the car's handling. Harvey Postlethwaite, we've mentioned him earlier, and he'd been drafted in, as I said, to help Ferrari solve their car problems, estimated that the Ferrari 126CK had, quote, a quarter of the downforce that the Williams or Brabham had that year. And it had an incredibly stiff ride too. It probably had less downforce than the Ligier and various others as well. Anyway, Villeneuve referred to it as, another nice quote, my big red Cadillac, because it would go fast enough on the straights but was awful around the corners. But despite all that, he arrived in Spain off the back of an improbable, remarkable victory at Monaco. And that's another great race that we could have spoken about, actually, but again, we haven't got time. But there at Monaco, an out-of-this-world qualifying lap by Villeneuve in that truck of a Ferrari had put him second on the grid to Nelson Piquet's underweight Brabham, may I say.
Surely not.
Allegedly. A full second faster than the next turbo-powered car and nearly 2.5 seconds, get that, 2.5 seconds quicker than his Ferrari teammate Didier Pironi, who was absolutely no slouch himself, Didier Pironi, was he? He was a fast driver.
Yeah, really quick.
Really quick. Anyway, Villeneuve then kept his cool in the race, and when Piquet crashed out and Alan Jones ran out of fuel, he was there to take a truly unlikely victory. And that was Monaco, of course.
Yes, that was a great win. Pretty well all wins at Monaco are great wins one way or another. And it showed that Gilles had it in him to do what all the greats do, which is win in a poor car.
Absolutely.
Although
absolutely.
I have to say, contrary to its driver's opinions, I rather liked the 126CK because it's always thrilling to watch a great driver working with a car that has more power than its chassis can handle.
I agree with you, to be fair.
Yeah.
I agree.
And actually, it's quite pretty in its funny way. But that Monaco win owed a fair amount to circumstance and the misfortune of others, whereas his win at Jarama was better still because it was all down to him. He'd qualified 7th on the grid and fully expected his Ferrari to destroy its tyres early on in the race. And according to another of our journalist friends, Peter Windsor, Gilles said that the handling was so spectacularly bad that the marshals were taking cover every time he arrived at a corner.
What a great image.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
But after he'd scythed his way up to 3rd at the start and then passed Carlos Reutemann's Williams for 2nd on lap 2, Villeneuve was in a position to inherit the lead on lap 14 when Alan Jones, who was leading in his Williams, made a mistake and went off. So with 66 laps to go and a queue of much quicker cars behind him, no one was seriously expecting Villeneuve to stay in front. But that's just what he did.
Yes, he did. And I think I'd like to read you another bit of Jerry Donaldson's Villeneuve book now, because he quite brilliantly summarises the last part of the race when Villeneuve was defying the odds to cling on to the lead. So this is Jerry now quoted. For the last 18 laps, the first 5 roared around and around like a high-speed freight train, a Ferrari engine leading the cars of Ligier, Jacques Lafitte, McLaren, John Watson, and Williams, Carlos Reutemann, with a Lotus caboose manned by Elio De Angelis, who had a small lead over teammate Nigel Mansell, who was 6th. Sorry, I was laughing then, because if you aren't aware of what a caboose is, remember that Jerry is Canadian. A caboose is a railroad car coupled to the end of a North American freight train. Anyway, here's Jerry's prose again. Quote, while his followers cornered as if on rails, Villeneuve's tired tyres afforded him ever more precarious purchase on an increasingly dirty track surface. The car doddered drunkenly on tiptoe through each of Jarama's 16 bends. Then, as the power of 550 prancing horses beneath his right foot was given full rein, the Ferrari surged ahead on the straights. His virtuoso performance created a concertina-like effect as the questing queue behind him closed up in the corners, then fell back in momentary exasperation before squeezing in behind him yet again. The pace was frenetic, the heat intense, and the tension electric as the final laps were reeled off. Gilles had only to lose concentration, fumble a gear change, or slide a millimetre offline, and he would instantly switch from victor to vanquished. Fantastic writing, isn't it?
Typical of Jerry.
Typical of Jerry. Anyway, it describes so well the tightrope that Villeneuve was walking or driving. He eventually held on to win by 1/5 of a second only from Lafitte, with the top 5 drivers covered by just 1.24 seconds. Oh, and here's a nice anorak fact, our first of this pod. In the last few laps, Villeneuve switched off his rev limiter, to hell with the consequences, and his engine held together to the finish despite that abuse.
Yeah, if that's not a Nuvolari touch, I don't know what is.
It really is.
Nuvolari wouldn't have had much time for rev limiters in those circumstances either. And it would have been very easy at that stage for Gilles to make a mistake. And actually, he wasn't particularly averse to making mistakes, largely because he pushed the limits so much. In fact, you remember we talked about his first F1 race at Silverstone for McLaren, when he'd surprised the team and rather disconcerted them by spinning at nearly every corner in practice.
Yeah.
Some people were shocked by that, but they didn't know Gilles. And it seemed like a pretty undisciplined way for a rookie to behave. But the truth was different, and when he was asked about it, he said, "How else can I tell how fast I'm going?" It was just his way of finding the limit.
Perfectly logical.
In Spain, he knew his and the car's limits, and he drove right up to, but never over them. Villeneuve's often remembered as a flamboyant, swashbuckling driver, a kind of cavalier of the track, but Spain showed that he was a clever, calculating one too. He could be a roundhead when he needed to be.
Indeed, and that's well put, I think. And Villeneuve would go on to say that it was the best race of his life. That was his view. And Gordon Murray, the great Gordon Murray, who was then Brabham's lead designer, went a step further, saying the following, and here's a Murray quote: "I honestly think it was the greatest drive I've ever seen by anybody." An extraordinary quote, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
Amazing quote. And he goes on to say, "That chassis is awful, worse by far than that of any other driver. His driving was just unreal. To get that car around 80 laps without making a mistake is an achievement. To do it when you're leading and under constant pressure is unbelievable." Great quote. Richard, where do you stand on the art of the defensive drive? Because actually that's what we're talking about. It was a defensive drive. They're very rare in Formula One these days because of the advent of DRS, of course. Is that a shame?
Well, you wouldn't want to see a defensive drive winning a race too often, but I do miss them a bit, whether they come off as Gilles' mesmerising drive did, or even when they come spectacularly unstuck. Matt, you're almost old enough to remember Monaco in 1970, when Jack Brabham crashed on the last corner of the final lap, handing the win to Jochen Rindt, who'd been hounding him for lap after lap. So, you know, that kind of thing, I used to think added to the entertainment.
I do too. It's not all about overtaking.
No, it isn't. We've spoken about how Enzo Ferrari came to love Gilles Villeneuve, perhaps more than any driver he'd worked with before, bar Tazio Nuvolari. After Spain, Enzo said, "Gilles Villeneuve on Sunday made me live again the legend of Tazio Nuvolari." And, as I said earlier, there's no higher praise. But what do you think, Matt? Do you think this was his best race? It certainly feels like the one where Gilles answered a lot of critics who thought he could perhaps only drive one way.
Oh, yes, I do. I do think it was his best race. In fact, I once wrote a column about that race for Motorsport, and my last paragraph was it Villeneuve's greatest race victory? It was. It was one of the greatest race victories of all time. And I meant by anyone. actually.
And that feels like a good time for our final ad break.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC. This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
We're going to move on now to the final race in our Gilles Villeneuve trilogy. And again, it's from 1981. We've gone for, drum roll, the 1981 Canadian Grand Prix, which might be a surprise to some, but we think it's another race that underpins Villeneuve's legendary ability and status. Notably, this was a wet race, and if you talk about Formula One's greatest drivers, they invariably excelled in the wet. You know, I'm talking about Clark, Stewart, Senna, Schumacher, Hamilton, Verstappen, all brilliant in the wet. And actually, well before the 1981 Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal, Villeneuve's prowess in the wet was already well known. One race that sticks in the memory is the 1979 United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, a very quick, very challenging circuit in the dry, let alone in the wet. On the Friday, it absolutely chucked it down. Most drivers thought it was too wet even to go out in the first session. Newly crowned world champion Jody Scheckter was one of those to venture out, and he admitted he'd scared himself rigid, posting a lap in torrential conditions of 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Remember that, 2 minutes and 11 seconds. He said, Jody, I thought I had to be quickest afterwards. Then I saw Gilles' time. I still don't really understand how it was possible. That was his quote. And guess what Gilles' time was? 2 minutes and 1 second. Almost 10 seconds faster than his teammate Scheckter had managed. And by the way, Scheckter had thought he must be fastest. He thought he'd nailed it that well. But he'd been beaten by 10 seconds in the same car. And far from being scared, Gilles was beaming from ear to ear when he returned to the pits, apparently. And that day, many of his peers admitted that Villeneuve was a cut above. Our mutual friend Nigel Roebuck, who we've mentioned before, the great autosport journalist, says that a watching Jacques Lafitte turned to him that day and said, look at him. He's different from the rest of us, on a separate level.
Can't argue with that. And the early years in snowmobiles must have had a lot to do with it when Gilles was learning how to feel the edge of adhesion in those conditions. Chris Amon actually said the only driver he ever saw with as much car control as Gilles was Jimmy Clark.
What massively high praise again.
Yeah, it's like being compared to Nuvolari by Ferrari.
It is.
Yeah. But the big difference between that wet race at Watkins Glen in 1979 and the one we're talking about at Montreal in 1981 was that the 1979 Ferrari was a nicely balanced car with a smooth power delivery from a normally aspirated flat 12 engine, whereas the turbocharged 81 Ferrari, as we mentioned, was not.
Yeah, I mean, after all, the 79 Ferrari was a world championship winning car.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
The Montreal circuit on the Ile Notre Dame is about 80 kilometres or so from Berthierville, where Gilles grew up with his younger brother Jacques. And the 1981 Canadian Grand Prix is notable for being the first of 3 Grand Prix where Jacques appeared in an F1 car. He tried and failed to qualify an Arrows A3, But that's another story and an anorak fact.
It is a good anorak fact. I don't think we can devote a podcast to the Arrows A3, perhaps.
I think so.
But it's a good anorak fact. Anyway, where were we? Yes, Jacques. I mean, Jacques Senior, of course, not the 1997 Formula One champion, Jacques Junior. Jacques Senior didn't qualify. Gilles qualified in 11th place. Not great. 1 place ahead of his Ferrari teammate Didier Pironi, although he managed to write his car off in practice and had to use a spare car for the race, in the days when teams were allowed spare cars, of course. But, in contrast to qualifying, the race would be not dry but wet. Very, very wet. And the rain favoured the teams contracted to Michelin, whose rain tyres were impressively grippier than the Goodyear wets. It wasn't therefore surprising that 2 seasoned old hands who had decent, but not brilliant, but decent cars underneath them, fitted with Michelins, they did rather well. I'm talking about Jacques Lafitte in a Ligier and John Watson in a McLaren. And they had qualified alongside each other on the 5th row, so nothing special. But in the downpour on race day, they drove superbly, both of them, on Michelins to finish first and second just 6 seconds apart. It was actually Lafitte's 6th and final Formula One win, and fair play to him for that. But we're actually here to talk about Villeneuve's eventful run to 3rd, so let's do that. On lap 40 of 63, Gilles came up to lap Elio De Angelis's Goodyear-tired Lotus at the hairpin, and the 2 cars collided. Both drivers spun, but both got going again. Villeneuve, now handicapped by a loose front wing. Characteristically undaunted, totally undaunted, Villeneuve, well, what do you think? He continued to race at full speed. Obviously, that was Gilles. And as he did so, the airflow licked around his Ferrari's loose front wing and the nose cone to which it was attached, kind of gradually bending the whole front assembly of the bodywork more and more, finally twisting it up and in front of the cockpit so that he could see past it only by craning his head from side to side. I mean, Google it. The photographs of his car at that point are truly amazing. You know, a loss of front downforce must have been the least of his worries. He could barely see.
Yeah. And of course, you'd be immediately black flagged at that point these days, wouldn't you? Or at least you'd be made to come into the pits at once and have the loose bodywork removed and replaced. And if you couldn't replace it, you'd be wheeled away.
Yes. And actually, it's interesting you should say that, because at the time, Jackie Stewart, who was in the TV commentary booth, predicted exactly that. He said he's going to be black flagged, but it never happened. I mean, he was the local hero at home, of course. Yeah. Anyway, instead, Villeneuve hatched a plan. The details of what happened next were little reported at the time, but they were witnessed and later written down by the one photographer who was standing resolutely, bravely, at the hairpin, soaked to the skin as the rain continued to fall. Richard Kelly. I'll quote him if I may, because as I say, he wrote about it, and it's great stuff. Here's the quote. Gilles' only chance was to deliberately break the nose cone and front wing clean off under braking. And the hairpin was where I thought he would do it. Sure enough, a few laps later, he absolutely buried the brake pedal, slamming the Ferrari's front end onto the pavement. The nose and front wing duly broke free as they jammed down onto the asphalt. Very smart thinking, Richard, but very Gilles.
Well, amazing that he not only thought of it, but managed to execute it. And he actually had quite a lot to think about apart from that, because the Ferrari's turbo engine was misfiring on part throttle, which, of course, in the rain, part throttle is what you need, all the way through the race.
It's an astonishing drive. As you know, I'm glad we've selected it as one of these three, because it's not on everybody's list, but I'm glad we have. Anyway, what happened next? Well, finally free of his bent-up front wing and nose cone, Villeneuve managed to control the resulting absolutely giant tank slapper. You can see it on YouTube, by the way. And yes, he completed the race in his Ferrari, technical term warning coming up, shitbox, minus bodywork in torrential rain, finishing third, having lapped everyone except the two men ahead of him. And get this, 11 drivers spun off or crashed out. And one, Alan Jones, not really the kind of person you regard as a shrinking violet, retired voluntarily. Even Jacques Lafitte, who won, said afterwards, quote, "I didn't like driving today." It's not a great quote, but it's a very clear quote. John Watson, second, better quote, as follows, "Today's conditions were the worst I've ever raced in." Guess what Villeneuve said? I'll tell you. Oh, it wasn't too bad.
Yeah, and that's another very clear example, not just of Villeneuve's driving ability, but of his whole attitude to racing. As Dennis Jenkinson of Motorsport wrote in his race report, he just doesn't know the meaning of giving up. And for Jenks, who wrote a wonderful book called The Racing Driver, that was the way a real racer should think.
Yeah.
Mauro Forghieri once described Gilles as having what he called a rage to win greater than any driver he'd known. Even though Gilles didn't win on this day, his desire to finish, and finish well, was obvious. And that's what endeared him so much to fans around the world, fans like you and me, Matt, I think.
Absolutely. And a rage to win is a great phrase.
Isn't it?
And very apt and accurate in describing Gilles Villeneuve. Anyway, that wraps up the third and final race in our trilogy. But don't go away yet, listeners, please, because before we go, I want to bring us back to the start of our conversation when we talked about Villeneuve being mentioned in the same breath as drivers like Senna, Clark, Fangio, and so on. Unlike those drivers, Gilles never won the Formula One Drivers' World Championship. He only won 6 Grand Prix, although perhaps he might have won if he hadn't been killed in 1982. He might have won that year. He probably would have done, I think. But maybe there's another title we can bestow on him other than World Champion. We've titled this episode 3 Races That Explain the Genius of Gilles Villeneuve. Do you think genius is an apt term, Richard?
Well, if he can be talked about in the same breath as Nuvolari, then to my mind that settles it, because Nuvolari was certainly a genius.
Yeah.
Was Gilles the best, though? Or the quickest? Better than Fangio or Schumacher? Quicker than Senna or Clark? Certainly we can say he was the most thrilling, anyway.
I think that's a good description.
Yeah, the first time I saw him live, I was standing in the Lotus pit at Zolder in 1978 when he came tearing into the pit next door during the race with the Ferrari's left front tyre in shreds, and there were no speed limits in the pit lane in those days. He'd been lying second behind Mario Andretti's Lotus 79, which was simply uncatchable, and he'd done almost a whole lap on that disintegrating tyre. And back then, of course, Ferrari pit stops weren't the precisely choreographed events they are today.
Not always today.
Well, no, that's true, but mostly. But in those days, they were something very different.
Yeah.
So excitement was guaranteed, even when Gilles wasn't going to finish higher than 4th, thanks to that stop. One thing that's clear is that while his daredevil tactics may have exasperated some of his rivals from time to time, there's no doubt that they all respected his ability enormously, and they almost universally liked him as a person too, because he was genuine, honest, and unpolitical.
If I can just stop you there a second, I never met him. I was 19 when he died. Did you ever meet him?
Not really. I mean, sort of brushed against him, as it were. But no, I never sat down and had a conversation.
Yeah, but people who did always say what a lovely chap he was.
Warm to him. I think that's absolutely right.
So,
whether he was going around the outside of Alan Jones through the 180-degree Tarzan at Zandvoort or diving inside Mario Andretti into Paddock Bend at Brands Hatch, those guys, 2 world champions, unhesitatingly gave him enough room to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah, indeed.
I also remember his unselfishness At Monza in 79, I was in a grandstand between the two Lesmo curves, watching him follow in Jody Scheckter's wheel tracks for the whole race, first and second. Gilles was already a Grand Prix winner, but he was working under team orders so that his team leader could take maximum points for the win and clinch the World Championship, which is what happened. And there was no hint of a complaint from Villeneuve, and that took discipline.
Yes, although, to be fair to Jody, and by the way, as I say, I never met Gilles, but I know Jody quite well and like him a lot. But to be fair to Jody, he says now that he gradually started shifting up on that day at Monza in 1979, shifting up at lower and lower revs to make sure that his engine would last to the end. First at 12,000 RPM, which was the normal shift-up point, then at 11,000, and finally at just 10,000. And running just behind, Gilles knew about that. Gilles knew what Jody, was doing, and he duly ran in line astern, as you say. But neither of them was driving anywhere near the limit. So I've always thought it was a bit unfair on Jody when people said Gilles could easily have won that race. The key thing, though, is, and as you say, is that Villeneuve didn't do the dirty on Scheckter at the very end to nick the win on the sly, as Pironi did to Villeneuve at Imola 3 years later, which I think is another podcast.
Yes, it is. Another day. But I still reckon that had they been racing each other properly, Gilles could have taken Jody if he'd been feeling selfish. But today at Ferrari, he has almost godlike status. I'm sure you know the famous photo of Gilles sitting next to Enzo Ferrari, both of them laughing their heads off.
Great picture.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And, you won't find many photos of the old man laughing in a public setting, not good for the image. But that's the effect Gilles had on him.
Yeah.
And I'd like to finish off by reading the words of Niki Lauda, spoken on the morning of the Belgian Grand Prix in 1982, the day after Gilles was killed in the final qualifying session. Quote from Niki: "Gilles was the perfect racing driver, I think. He had the best talent of all of us. In any car he was quick. He didn't drive for points, but to win races. I liked him even more than I admired him. He was the best and the fastest racing driver in the world." Unquote.
That's a great quote. And if you think of the people whom we have quoted singing Villeneuve's praises over the past hour, it's a remarkable
Yes,
list.
It is.
Yeah.
And I don't think we'd find anybody to contradict them either.
No, indeed. I think that feels like a great place to say, and colossally that's history. We really have loved looking back at some highlights of Gilles Villeneuve's career. And if he was a driver who was perhaps fairly unfamiliar to you before you heard this podcast, well, we hope we've done a decent job of conveying what this extraordinary driver meant, and means still, to Formula One. And of course, if you were already a Gilles Villeneuve fan, well, we hope you've enjoyed hearing Richard and me wax lyrical about him for an hour or so.
And if you'd like to share your thoughts about Gilles or any of the other subjects we've touched on in this series, you can get in touch via podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at rwilliams1947 and Matt is at the Bish F1. And remember, if you want to enjoy ad-free listening or treat yourself to some supremely stylish colossally merch, there are links to both in the episode description.
Yes, there are. And I think that'll do for this week, won't it? So, until next time, with thanks, very great thanks, to our ace producer Jonny Reynolds, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.
Did you know users searched football on eBay.com last season 12,000 times per hour? That's some serious searching. eBay has been the home of collectibles since 1995 and is the largest online marketplace for trading cards. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Come through and collect with us today.